Welcome to Japan Politics Explained, where I review recent news and statistics regarding politics and elections in Japan. Today's video is a short explainer on a key concept that is crucial to understanding the political dynamics of post-war Japan, and that is Habatsu, or factions. This video will hopefully clarify how one party was able to rule Japan for almost its entire post-war history, and why Yoshihide Suga was able to become the Prime Minister of Japan. Part 1. What are factions? Let's start with the basics. In most cases, when we use the word faction, I mean factions in Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party. Japan has many political parties, but the biggest of them all is the Liberal Democratic Party, with about 380 members in the Japanese parliament at the moment, or more than half the seats. With so many members, it's difficult to keep all of them satisfied and united, so smaller groupings are bound to appear. That's where factions, or Habatsu, comes in. There are 7 factions in the LDP at the moment, with the largest faction containing almost 100 members and the smallest having only 10. There are also around 60 LDP members who are not aligned to any faction. Factions are structured much like a political party of its own, with a boss, other senior members, and ordinary members. Faction seniority is often based on how many times you have been elected. Factions are often referred to by the names of their bosses, such as the Kishida faction and the Hosoda faction. However, they also have official names, such as Kochikai for the Kishida faction, and the Seiwa Seisaku Kenkyukai for the Hosoda faction. Part 2. The functions of a faction. Everything that a faction exists for can be summed up in 2 words: power and money. Let's focus first on power. Faction members nominate and support their bosses to become party leaders in the LDP presidential election. As Japan is a parliamentary democracy in which the leader of the ruling party almost always becomes prime minister, becoming LDP president is basically the same thing as becoming Japan's prime minister. Therefore, having many people in one's own faction is important for a serious contender for the prime minister seat. In order to get many people to join their factions, bosses do what they can to support junior members at elections. That means giving them money for campaign funds and stumping for them. Bosses also help members get important positions in the government or in the LDP, such as ministerial roles, by drawing up recommendation lists. Factions also work to educate younger party members. Veteran faction members teach newcomers the ins and outs of fighting elections, introduce them to prominent bureaucrats and industry leaders, and sometimes hold policy study sessions. Part 3. The birth of a faction. Many factions trace their roots back to 1955, which is the year that the LDP was formed following a merger of 2 conservative parties, the Japan Democratic Party and the Liberal Party. The JDP had a hawkish foreign policy stance, and its main goals were to revise the post-war pacifist constitution, which they perceived as having been imposed by foreigners, and remilitarizing the country. For economic policies, the party was for fiscal balance and austerity. Meanwhile, the liberals were more dovish on the world stage, taking a policy of cooperation with the United States. Its economic policies included active fiscal spending. As the 2 parties had different political ideologies and goals, it was only natural that factions would form in the party. With the conservative merger all but ensuring that the LDP will always be in the majority, much of the political drama of the mid to late 20th century occurred not among Japan's political parties, but between LDP's many factions. For example, 5 factions called the Sankaku Daifukuchu bitterly fought in the 70s for leadership of the party and by extension the government. They were Takeo Miki, Kakue Tanaka, Masayoshi Ohira, Takeo Fukuda, and Yasuhiro Nakasone. The Tanaka and Ohira factions' roots can be traced back to the Liberal Party, while the Miki, Fukuda, and Nakasone factions came from what used to be the JDP. The internal conflict was politically expedient for the LDP at large, as scandals and other issues would not result in the party losing popularity and being kicked out of government. For example, when Kakue Tanaka stepped down over a bribery scandal, he was replaced by Takeo Miki, who had a reputation as being clean and free from money issues. That kept the public voting for the LDP despite the issues. Part 4. The decline of factions. Despite the key roles factions played in modern Japanese politics, they are not as strong compared to before. That's because a change in election rules in 1994, which made lower house constituencies first past the post districts instead of multi-member districts, severely weakening the ability of factions to influence the party. The LDP almost always ran more than one candidate in multi-member districts so that it can maintain its majority. That meant that there was a possibility of losing potential voters to another LDP candidate and failing to become elected. It was in such a circumstance that candidates turned to factions with their money and campaigning support. But since only one candidate can run in a single-member district, that left candidates turning to the party headquarters for support instead of faction leaders. In fact, who can run in which district was left up to the decision of HQ instead of whichever faction had the resources to back a bid. That significantly weakened factions. Part 5. What factions are there now? That being said, factions still play a role in LDP's internal politics. Now I'll be introducing some of the factions that are around today. The largest faction in existence right now is the Seiwa Seisaku Kenkyukai. The 96-member faction is led by Hiroyuki Hosoda and is the faction of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. With roots in the JDP, many of its members are strong proponents of revising the constitution. Fumio Kishida, one of the candidates in the election following the resignation of Prime Minister Abe, belongs to the Kochikai, the fifth biggest faction. It is the oldest surviving faction, having been formed in 1957. With roots in the Liberal Party, the Kishida faction is hesitant about revising the constitution and is aiming for a foreign policy more in step with Japan's neighbors. The Shikokai, led by Finance Minister Taro Aso, is the faction of Administrative Reform Minister and potential PM candidate Taro Kono. You can check out my previous video for more on Kono's shot at the PMC. It became the second biggest faction in 2017, following a merger of the Aso faction, made up of hawkish members and lawmakers under the lineage of the Liberals, and the Santo faction with roots in the JDP. Part 6. What about Suga? So far, I've explained the basics of factions in Japan, but this begs the question, where does the current Prime Minister, Yoshihide Suga, fit into all of this? The answer is a bit complex. Suga is the first ever LDP president to not be from a faction. So at first glance, it looks like the continuation of the 1994 decline of power of factions. However, a closer look reveals that it is actually the factions pulling the strings behind Suga. Let's go back in time to before the start of the coronavirus outbreak in 2020. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe looked like a giant, having survived major scandals to continue leading the party with high approval ratings after over 7 years in office. No one in the LDP dared challenge Abe, but instead jockeyed for approval from him as a successor, giving them the nickname post-Abe candidates. However, the post-Abe candidates knew that it would be a while before Abe would want to step down, and rushing efforts to boost their public image now would only be seen as a challenge towards the Prime Minister, so most did not expand their political influences and rack up political capital. In fact, there were talks that the LDP may change its rules to allow Abe to serve a fourth term as party president, extending his tenure to as long as until 2024. Then came the coronavirus crisis. The stress from the government's mishandling of the COVID crisis finally got to the seemingly unbeatable Abe, triggering health issues and leading to his abrupt resignation in August. Because no one had expected Abe to step down this early, the field to replace Abe was wide open. There was also the issue of people not wanting to take the position amid the shambles the country was in from the COVID crisis. This led to a scramble within the party. Toshiro Nikai was the first to approach Suga with the possibility of succeeding Abe. Nikai led his own faction, which was by no means large but still powerful. This was because Nikai was the LDP's Secretary General, which is basically the chief of the party in internal matters, including for elections. As I said earlier in this video, the electoral reform of 1994 gave the party leadership the power to choose candidates, stripping factions of their clout. So Nikai had the strongest position in the party, and he wanted to keep that influence. So he moved quick, propping up Suga, who was the chief government spokesman and a close aide to Abe, as the righteous heir to the Abe brand of politics. The move put other factions, who were still scrambling for candidates to back, in a frenzy. Aso, who was also a confidant to Abe, felt excluded from the power center formed by the former prime minister and seemingly taken by Nikai and Suga. So in an unprecedented move, Aso orchestrated a joint press conference between him and the leaders of the Takeshita and Hosoda factions, the number 1 and number 3 factions in the party, bringing the 3 biggest factions together to announce their support for Suga. By uniting together to prop up Suga, they wanted to weaken Nikai's sway over him. Suga's status as an independent LDP member also gave factions the power to influence how ministers were selected, as Suga does not have a faction to which he can give favors. Suga ultimately ended up forming a cabinet that more or less reflected the power balance in the party. So the sudden void of power left by Abe and the factionless nature of Suga gave faction leaders the opening they needed to flex their muscles. And that's how Suga took the prime minister's seat. Thank you so much for watching, and please hit the like and subscribe buttons, and let me know in the comments what content you'd like to see in the next video.